to introduce to you our presenter for today, which is Dr. Sophia Wang, who is an associate professor of psychiatry, neurology, and internal medicine at Indiana University. She's the Wesley P. Martin Endowed Scholar for Alzheimer's Education and an ABPN board-certified geriatric psychiatrist. She currently serves as the NIA designated leader of the Indiana Alzheimer's Disease Research Center OREC Core and is the co-chair of the NeuroNext Recruitment and Retention Committee. And she is a member of our CTMC Executive Committee. So today her presentation is titled Incorporating Participants' Perspective in Clinical Trial Design. Thank you, Sophia, and I'll turn it over to you. Looks great. The only thing is that you're muted.
Mute myself. All right, there we go. Can everybody see my slides? Hopefully you're not seeing a multi-view situation. Okay.
We can.
Looks good.
Okay. All right. Well, I really again want to thank the executive committee and Megan for organizing this. We're going to be talking about probably one of the I think most practical topics that you'll hear about, and it's probably one of the least discussed, but it'll either frankly make or break your clinical trial, and that is recruitment. And what we're really going to begin to think about today is a couple of things, and that is how to get your participants' perspective on clinical trials are, and also begin to touch a little bit on some of the issues and challenges that individuals often encounter, especially early in their career at academic centers. So I do hope actually this will be a little bit more interactive. I don't want you to feel like you have to sit there and listen. Please feel free to hop in at any time. And I want to have this be as interactive as possible. So we're really going to begin, I think, with a key question of obstacles and facilitators, and then beginning to understand the science of engagement, which I think a lot of people just view engagement as a sort of touchy-feely. I'll just have it be an intuitive process, but beginning to understand this, we are scientists, we are researchers, understanding this as a scientist. And then how do you take this from engagement to enrollment? And then I hope folks will actually chime in and have a bit more of a discussion-driven process for real world problems. All right, so we're going to start off with obstacles here. And I think, as many of you know, it can be very challenging to be enrolling certain patient populations in neurodegenerative disorders and clinical trials. This is probably one of the biggest delays in drug development, is because recruitment often doesn't happen as quickly as we anticipate. Trials take a lot longer than we hope, and really beginning to understand the factors of what drives participation. And once you're recruiting, it's really not just recruitment. You also think about how to retain them for your studies, right? Because many studies are not just one and done, right? We have to follow them over a few years, and making sure that we collect meaningful time points to look at change. And then we also have to begin to think about, well, are there some general principles that we can also apply across our clinical trial populations? So I actually want to begin here, again, with the science and the literature, just looking at a systematic review. This was done actually for 4 major neurodegenerative disorders: Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, and Huntington's. And they also did some nice qualitative thematic analyses. But the idea is, again, we want to think right now that 50,000 feet, because many of the challenges that we've seen in recruitment are not just specific to that disease, but is a cross-cutting challenge. So this systematic review looked at 36 studies. And I think what was really nice is that they looked at the feedback from a wide range of individuals. They took a really 360 view with patients, caregivers, and healthcare professionals. And they looked at several factors, why patients might enroll or might not, including, do they think they benefit from help, participating in these studies, altruism, wanting to help others, but also challenges related to study, right? It does take time and effort to be in a treatment. And then also there's that chance, right? Somebody's going to be randomized to placebo if it's a randomized controlled trial. And then the study burden, right? All the procedures to be done, especially, imaging, even collecting blood, lumbar puncture, those can all take time. And then finally, are there factors related to the healthcare professional, depending on what quality of information they were getting and the relationship between the patient and the physician? So I thought this is a really nice weighted flow chart. And you can see here that they looked at about 268 patient-related for factors. And what really stood out as to why people from a patient-related standpoint would participate in a study was, not surprisingly, altruism was a big one. And the other one was health benefit. And the altruism fell into two categories: contribution to science and general. And there was a few other also things that popped up. Access to care was one of them, and hoping to learn about the condition. But really, altruism and health benefit were the big ones. Now, as we began to look at, potential barriers or facilitators for study-related factors, I think one thing that really stood out is the administrative, what we often think about as the administrative component, but how a study is organized. And as many of you begin to think about study design, it's probably not discussed enough, but financial compensation, travel burden, but the biggest one is time. In some ways, you could say time is money, but especially for many of these neurologic disorders in which people are either working or if they're not working, depend on the goodwill of another individual who is working to bring them in. Time is not surprisingly one of the biggest barriers for why people might not participate. And then with study treatment, again, one of the things that stood out is the concerns about side effects. And then 84 studies looked at healthcare professional related factors. And I think one thing, and we saw this also in our own studies when we looked at the ADRC and why people participate in those studies, is information. People are really looking to get more information, to understand what's happening to them and why. And I think that's not something that always intuitively comes to us as researchers, because we're so deeply embedded in our field and we feel like, oh, everyone that knows, everything that they need to know are joining our studies. But it's actually in some ways, maybe the opposite. People are joining our studies hoping to learn more, and fulfilling that educational need can provide, I think, a meaningful basis for a relationship that will help not only with recruitment, but with retention. So I think that is one of the key aspects to take away here as we begin to think about, why people participate in studies. Discussion about altruism is important. And I do see people talk a lot about the financial compensation. Then you run into, challenges with the IRB, right? What's too much? What's too little? But compensation, if you want to put that in quotation marks, isn't just financial. It's also intellectual, right? And that's one of our strengths as clinical trials researchers, is to begin to think about how we can engage our participants by giving them information that they're looking for, right? Making sure these clinical trials are also an educational experience, not just a research experience. Many of the study and healthcare professional factors we brought up, those are things that, are within some reason within our control and really are worth reflecting on. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, hopefully, in our discussion, but really thinking about patient-centered trial design. So really trying to, again, this gets back to the title, is thinking about how a participant will view this study. And a lot of the systematic review wasn't able to capture enough information about groups at higher risk for these neurologic disorders and older patients. So some of these answers may be different, but I can say that our center, which did a study looking at one group at higher risk for Alzheimer's disease, which the African American and Black population, those older adults answered very similarly, particularly for information. So I think this is pretty reaffirming of that. Okay, so now I'm gonna move on now to the science of engagement. And I think what's really important here is when we talk to people, right, and they're engaged, they're like, well, you just know it when it happens, right? But at the same time, why are some experiences engaging and why are some not? And I think what I have found really helpful is that the PCORI, which stands for Patient Centered Outcomes Research Institute, has done a really nice job of studying engagement. A lot of it is not necessarily randomized clinical trials, but more for what they call patient-centered comparative effectiveness research. But I think the important thing is, participants, no matter what type of study design, they're people. And I think this will at least help all of us begin to understand there is a conceptual process behind engagement. It's not just, well, I'll just kind of feel my way through this. So what you can see here is that they've really begun to outline things in 5 different concepts. And the first one is engagement context. The second one is activities, engagement qualities, partner outcomes. So they really, and I think this is an important idea that we can begin to, as we talk about what our patient centered studies, really beginning to think of our patients not so much as subjects, but as equal partners, in designing and also giving us feedback about our studies. But I think research outcomes, we're very much focused on these elements here. So I think we'll be talking more about this during our in-person course, but often we focus on, are our participants, are they representative of what we know about the disease process, right? How quickly are we finishing our study, right? This is a huge focus, especially when you have sponsors involved or you have, funding grants, right, that have a finite period, making sure you stay on track with both participant accrual, but also retention. And in a way, this very much relates then to the patient centeredness of studies. And then I think the other thing is, and we have to think about this a bit more as scientists, is I think one of the misconceptions that I see many junior people have is that they just think, well, if I talk to people once, and I'm a very engaging person, they'll join my study. And I think what people begin to realize as they start to work with a certain patient population is that you'll end up going back to those same groups, because you're a disease specialist quite often, right? So you're going to end up conversing with them, whether it's their family members, other people, right, who maybe say in patient interest groups or advocacy groups, right? They all talk to each other. They often interact, especially younger people on social media. And word gets around. And so I think what's really important is to think very broadly and long term about 2 things. First of all, if you're new to the field in terms of research, sharing with people what are the importance of study findings that have occurred, right? And why do we now need to do this study? I think one of the biggest questions I get is, we've already done so much research, right? Why do you need more research? Okay, and I think being able to answer the why is very critical as you talk to your patients, as you give talks to patient interest groups and advocacy groups. And I think the other important thing is release of findings. So I want to clarify what that means. Release of findings for us as researchers means, did you publish, right? Did you get your, first, author paper in, New England Journal of Medicine? Did you get your first author paper in JAMA? Okay. But many patients, I mean, you get a few, right, who are savvy and who will be reading those, right? We are trying to make more information publicly available. Many people don't even know what PubMed is. And so making sure that we release those findings in, first of all, a forum that people, from all communities can access is important. But here's the other key thing I've also found is that even the savviest patients, I've worked with, or the people who are very savvy in the community, will be like, I read X. And they either have questions about what it means, they're not sure if it's relevant to them, even if it's, like you have this disease, oh, it should be relevant, but is it? And so it has to be release of findings in a way that is relevant and readable to that person who is your prospective study participant. Because if they don't see those two aspects of relevance and it's something that is readable that they can relate to, they're not going to be somebody that you can recruit for your study because they won't see the research as something that they can form a partnership with. And so I think that element is also very important as well when you give talks to the community. I think one of the best things that has really helped me, I want to add, as you go out and give talks to the community or patient groups, is to get a really honest sounding board, to get somebody who obviously is sharp and a good speaker, but isn't in the field. That way they can give you really on target feedback on what you are presenting well and what you're not presenting well. And by getting that person who will be willing to sit there, in this case, I was very grateful to have individuals from my community advisory board who came to listen to me speak. By getting that feedback, I was able to improve over time because everything that you say makes sense to you, but does it make sense to the people you're communicating to? And I think that's really, really important. You won't know that unless you have somebody there from the community who is invested in helping to spread the word and willing to give you that feedback. Okay, so I think there's a few things that we want to begin to think about here, that engagement, there's a science to it. And I think there's different ways of measuring this, but one thing I really want to take a moment to emphasize here, I know we have, again, pointed out a few of the domains, is engagement context. And so I think many of you are either thinking about or are proposing the multi-site study. And one thing that's really critical is before you go in, especially if you're thinking multi-site to recruit, is that you understand the context not only of your multi-site network, if you're working as part of a clinical trials network, but that you deeply understand as well the individual sites. Because how you recruit, the resources and circumstances can really drive how well you are able to engage people, or your site PIs are able to engage people, and how well you can retain them as well. All right. Okay, so let's move on here. Okay, so again, I think we want to, this gets back to what we talked about earlier about study related aspects, the topic of the study and study design. So I think this is something worth mentioning about recruitment versus what your study materials say. And you're like, well, what does that mean? So one of the key things that I have learned, for example, is that discussion of Alzheimer's disease, especially to a de novo audience in some communities, it can bring up a lot of strong feelings. And depending on how people feel about it, right, and how well they know you or don't know you, that may or may not go well. And so I want to point out that when the topic of discussion in the community, when you're trying to recruit people, brain health, for example, tends to carry, in my experience, a more positive connotation and leaves it open-ended for the people that you are trying to recruit, particularly community, to be the ones say, oh yes, and I had, my mother or my sibling who had dementia. It lets them drive the conversation. And what you want to begin to think about is, you can talk about research characteristics, right? But when you begin your approach as you recruit, that you need to figure out how to let them lead you to the topic of study and the study design. And so going in, for example, and just having just jumping right into it and starting to talk about randomized controlled trials, for say, monoclonal antibodies for a neurodegenerative disorder, you want to get there, but you want to get there really thoughtfully. And so I think I want to point out that, because people often aren't aware that what you bring up for recruitment versus the topic, the study and the study design, is going to be really something that has to be a lot of thought put into it. Again, you also have to figure out when you get to know people before you bring a study design. One of the things I have found is that randomized controlled trials can seem like a very foreign concept and very anxiety provoking for certain individuals, especially if they've not had a lot of say in their healthcare. So, really looking at the trust levels and their readiness to talk about research studies is really important before you put on that researcher hat and start to talk about your topic of study and your study design. So, really understanding your audience before you jump into it. Okay. So I think this is really important is the concept of managing engagement. And especially for longitudinal studies, um, I think what's really, really critical is to make sure, especially as a PI, if accrual is not occurring, especially at the rate that you're anticipating, to see what your study staff have to say. Often they're the ones who really understand what are the likely things to sort of what the levers are to get people engaged and how responsive they will be, right, to your prospective participants. And I think really listening to all those perspectives is really, really critical. And I can't emphasize how much we're going to talk about this later, that it's really important that you be able to pivot. As a PI, we get invested in our study design, and I think one of the hardest things is to change. But when something isn't happening the way we expect, it is up to us as the PI, right? We can't change the people we're recruiting. We have to change our study design. And I think that gets back to the really important concept of understanding again the functioning and the group dynamics, right? This is where having focus groups as well can be helpful in the study design. I think I've talked to some people about that, seeing how they feel about the study design before you even launch the study and getting that feedback is really critical. Okay. Um, and I think the other thing that I think is important, and this is something actually a lot of people who are early in their career as investigators, they may not fully realize, but the institutions that we represent and the relationships we have with our patient populations in a way that really can be a huge effect that we may not anticipate. So, how we treat people not only impacts our study and your own future studies, but it impacts how people perceive the institution. Likewise, all the studies that have been done before you and how those experiences went also impacts them. So, I really urge people to really understand the landscape before and after. This will help give you a clear concept of what that trust level is so that way you can successfully launch into recruitment. Okay. And I think we talked about these. So let me kind of begin to really begin to think about as you develop, especially if you're developing a community advisory board or a patient advisory board. And this is something that I think a lot of studies are headed towards is getting that patient voice is if you can, trying to get those patient opinions early from a large number of groups if there's opportunities to engage them and pay them accordingly for their feedback, I think that's also very important as well. And really taking a look objectively, right? Recruitment is the end point, right? Or at least one of the key, at least measures, right, of how well you've engaged someone. So really trying to understand all the factors before by getting feedback throughout the process is really critical. Okay. So now we're going to transition a little bit from the very abstract topic of engagement to enrollment. And especially for folks as they are launching, their first study, this can be like a huge event. It's both exciting, but also very daunting. So it's really about climbing, as we would say, your personal Mount Everest. So I think, especially when we're launching to our first study, we often just tend to think about our study protocol. But I think it's really important to understand your 50,000 feet vision, where you're going with this study is just the beginning of a journey. And really finding what I call your Sherpas, the people who are going to guide you. It could be mentors, it could be other people in your field who have done similar work, maybe not quite the same disease, but especially if you're trialing like some of the newer study designs, they'll be providing feedback and listening to them. I think also making sure, and this is probably one of the biggest challenges I see, is about people getting preliminary data for their recruitment, right? They've picked a number that they think is right, but then they discover it's either not headed in the right direction, or they find that they've not gotten the resources that they need. And they're like, oh, wait, I don't have enough funds to do X, or I needed help from this person. It's not always monitored. I need help to do that. And then again, if you're thinking about that multi-site study, that summit, where you want to go, understanding the landscape. And then we're going to talk about this a bit more, recruitment as a team effort. I think for many of us who have been successful, with solo endeavors, this can be a bit of a change of a process, but really understanding research, but particularly recruitment as a team effort. And then I can't emphasize in some ways for 9 and 10 how important this is, but every single person that you will meet is going to potentially be a potential individual who can help refer people to your study. So treating them well is really important. And failure is part of the process. I have failed too, just to be transparent. And so being able to pivot as you go through each step is really critical. Okay. So I think the first thing is you need to understand what your 50,000 feet vision is, right? Are you going to end up at a multi-site study, right? Or is it such a rare disorder, it's never going to be, phase 3, but, you're going to get the data that you're going to get. And I think by understanding where you want to end up, this will help you both from a career standpoint, but also from a recruitment standpoint of what you want to be achieving. And as you can tell, there's these sort of interim points, and you want to be checking each of those out and making sure you're on track to that. And recruitment can be a very treacherous business. And so I can't emphasize the importance of finding people who have successfully done this before. Don't guess, don't try to do this on your own. It's very unlikely that you are the first person doing this study in this particular population. You might be doing that particular study design or that particular drug, but somebody else has gone before you. And so as you listen to them, right, I think it's very easy for people to be optimistic. And I think optimism is good because what drives you to keep on climbing. But having a conversation with people about their failure points can also be really, really informative. Understanding how people overcame those failures is even more important. And it can make the difference between whether you make it to the top or not. Not everybody makes it to the top of Mount Everest. And it looks like it's easy, but it's not always. Okay. So I think one of the biggest things that I have seen is when people collect their data about recruitment, it's not always for the right mountain or for the right, aka the right type of study design. So I have chatted with people, right? And they're like, well, how many people do you think you get? Oh, my PI did this study and they got this many people. I'm optimistic it won't be a problem to get this number of people for my RCT. And then I said, okay, well, tell me about your PI study. And then I discover when I chat with them, right, it's a single time point observational study in the hospital, right? But now you're proposing something quite different, right? You're proposing a multi-site randomized clinical drug trial with longitudinal time points. And so getting the numbers is really important, but making sure that you get the right type of numbers for the right type of study design will help you get a much better sense of how feasible something is. And I think that's often why, people think, right, the resources you need to climb Mount Kilimanjaro is not the same as K2 nor as Mount Everest, right? So you want to go with the right resources, and that comes getting with the right preliminary data. So money is important, but it's not just about money. And I put money on the right, not because it's not important, but because resources come in many forms. I think for junior investigators, tapping that experience is important. But I can't tell you even how more important, if I had to pick one, interestingly enough, it would be goodwill. Goodwill can get you a colleague who's willing to help you can make all the difference, because goodwill, in a sense, can save you so much time. Yes, you need to work with your institution free, but it can save you a lot of money and time, and maybe they'll even help you find some space, and they'll give you some experience. So beginning to, as you think about your resources, if I had to pick one, goodwill in a way can grow itself, right? Money, once it's spent, goes away. Experience is great. It can only go so far, but goodwill is, I think, probably the top thing. And really think about goodwill coming from a wide range of people, your mentors, your institutions. But I also want to emphasize people in the community have been so helpful when they hear what you're doing as trying to help them, and they hear how important this is for their community to feel better and to get better. I've been really pleasantly just taken aback in a very good way how much goodwill they have shown me, because I have shown them goodwill. And I think that's really important. So this gets back to an earlier point I have. Really start to, and you can't perfectly plan everything. Begin to think about each study, right? Starting off, if you're a feasibility study or a phase 2, but how you get to your phase 3, if that's where you want to get. And that brings me back to goodwill. If it goes well for the feasibility study and you share your results and people are buying into it, success begets success. And that's what you want to begin to think about as you go through all of this. And really, another key aspect is understanding the landscape, right? It's very unlikely, at certain institutions that you will be the only person doing a study in that field with that patient population. Okay, so there are in some places, maybe like certain community-based hospitals, it's a solo effort. But most people are part of a range, right? So there's co-enrolling studies, right? And it may be that they have the same eligibility criteria close enough that, especially for rare diseases, you have to think about how can we be collaborative, right? Rather than competitive. And also research culture is really, really important. And that comes from the leadership, but can also, come as you, as how you treat people, and generating that goodwill. Okay. So I think it used to be that when we were not hitting recruitment targets, people were like, oh, just go talk to people more. But there's actually a wide range of people who can help inform your recruitment efforts. Some of these are obvious, but I think one that I hope we'll be able to talk more about is people who have experience in mixed methods and qualitative research, because that really helps to figure out how to help make your patients your studies more patient-centered. And community-engaged researchers, depending on your type of study, if you're going in the community, that can be also really informative. But in the world of big data, especially if you're working in healthcare systems, a lot of EHRs have, often, by the way, free tools to help give you a sense of at least somewhat of the patient eligibility. And that, I think, is also an under-tapped resource as well. So I've listed a wide range of people depending on where you are in your study, but I want to highlight those as tools, especially for those of you who are beginning your career, to not forget to tap. And you'd be surprised, a little bit of just a summer project to help you inform you about the patient perspectives of your study can really change how you want to design your study, or what type of recruitment materials that you want to use, and make things go a long way. Okay. Again, I think I just said goodwill. You can never have enough goodwill. I'm telling you, goodwill can either make or break your study. And every person, I view every person as an ally. I view every person that I meet in the community, in my clinic, as a friend. And I think that's really important, especially with all the challenges for recruitment. And I think one thing I wanted to point out finally for this aspect is failure is part of the process. No one's ever going to quite have done it as you, and that's okay. But be willing to pivot, especially as you get feedback if something doesn't work. Okay, so now we're going to transition here. And then hopefully we can, I want to really leave this open to dialogue, because I think it's easier to kind of problem solve as a group. But here are some real world problems. These are some that other colleagues have encountered. These are some that I've personally encountered. or been asked to help with. So these are two different scenarios, but this again gets to the same conceptual idea, right? The first one is you have, in this case, plastic surgeons, and they're not interested, in referring participants to a randomized controlled trial in which there's a novel surgical treatment that might actually help migraines. The other one is, primary care providers, right? Not being interested in referring people to effectiveness study to participate in common screening for early detection of Alzheimer's disease. So I think one of the biggest concepts that I have had to try to encourage people to do is like, we're going to change everybody else. And it's like, well, actually, recruitment is a great opportunity for me to reflect on how I can change myself in response to the environment and engage people. Because especially now when you get referrals from outside another discipline, figuring out how to change your perspective to engage people is really, really critical. And I think, many of us come here with this ideal. And then if, for us, this is like really sort of pie in the sky. But especially if our referral sources are coming in with realistic constraints and make it very difficult. Question is, how do you begin to shift that balance, right? How do you get them to recognize, especially if they don't have the same type of clinical training or interest, right? They may not be interested in the disease that you're feeling so passionate about. How do you get them to even see the light, as they say? So I think getting feedback at every step of the way is critical for all studies. And I may have like sort of glossed over it, but partnership with every single person is really, really critical. Sometimes it's the study design, right? Sometimes they have other priorities, and beginning to figure out how to engage the departmental leadership is a possibility. Sometimes it's not. Um, Sometimes there's fundamental scientific disagreement at a conversation today with students. There's a wide range of views on, cognitive screening in older people. You think that would be just kind of obvious, from a Alzheimer's disease specialist, we should all be doing this. But I think a lot of this was having a conversation and saying, when we look at different guidelines for different subspecialties, they get different guides from primary care to psychiatry to neurology to geriatrics. So, how do you begin to reconcile when there's getting different disagreements? Sometimes there's interpersonal differences that pre-existed you, and beginning to understand and navigate those, right? You probably can't change those too much, but beginning to understand how to navigate those and finding, and I always point this out with people, everyone that you're going to be working with, they're in a healthcare setting. They're here to help somebody. And so finding common ground is really, really critical. And I can't emphasize again the goodwill and alliances for successfully navigating, I think, a good chunk of the interpersonal differences that inevitably arise, when people are working together, under, very sometimes a lot of time constraints and resource constraints. So infrastructure challenges, and I think some of our CTMC faculty have pointed out, you really need somebody who is embedded in the institution and understands the institution to help you successfully recruit. Because that is one thing that is this huge moving target. And I can't emphasize enough, you need to have somebody who is really, if it's not you, especially if you're not a practicing clinician that's a specialist, right? I'm, working with primary care, for example, right? I don't understand what the primary care providers are going through directly, right? But you need that sort of frontline individual who can keep you, on the know and be like, hey, these are what they're experiencing, because that may be different from month to month. And I think this is where trying to collect true data, whether it's anonymous surveys, some sort of focus group, and although it would sound the least scientific, I've actually found to be the most helpful. And that is, again, that listening ear, just kind of gently hearing what people have to say. I would say that if you have goodwill, people will come and share things with you. And the information they share and confide into you can really help and affect how you intellectually approach your recruitment, especially if it's not, within your specialty, especially if you're doing interdisciplinary. And so moving forward and finding common ground is really critical. And I know this is very sort of touchy-feely, but it's really those interpersonal skills are going to really be important. And what I want to point out is the really big part is make sure, don't just try to get something for the moment. Sometimes you have to let things go, but making sure you build long-term alliances, because you're going to need to do another study hopefully after that one, right? And even if you're successful for that study, if you've lost an ally who can help you for your next study, at the end of the day, you may not have gone, and you may have taken one step forward, but you might have taken two steps back for your next study. And I think making sure that you're engaging and getting their voices, whether it's through co-designing sessions, surveys, making sure that they know that you value your feedback is really, really critical. All right, so I can just tell you right now, making sure, and this is really important to have those conversations early on. These are some examples of things that people have handed to me, situations, and I can't help but emphasize that when you start to recruit, it's very important to get the feasibility, whether it's observational studies, or RCTs. And I hope we're actually going to talk about a little bit more. We can come back to this on how we want to handle that. But when you go back and you think about it, it's either because they didn't match to the right type of study design, things changed, right? A key person who was in charge of recruitment, like a site PI, moved on with their career. Um, or, they changed healthcare system, like, their EHR, and made things difficult, or something changed. So making sure that you really understand the infrastructure component is really critical as you calculate the enrolled numbers. And I want to point out, it's really a good idea to continue not to do one-time feasibility, one and done, especially if you're not embedded in that field. So again, if you're doing that interdisciplinary work, especially now with EHR, I would encourage people to really make sure they're checking regularly, especially with EHR. That's something that you can do, every few months, right? An infrastructure can change how many stroke patients you get in the ER, things like that. So I think it's a really, really good idea. So this is something that, especially, and this is probably better to refer to than to read through right now, is thinking about why recruitment estimates are inaccurate. But if you're not getting the numbers that you expect, there's either, some sort of reason. I find people are either overly optimistic or something has changed, right? And so really, or it could be both. So I think sort of maybe referring to this, in the future can be a little bit more helpful, but trying to make sure that if you're, and we're all a little bit off, but if we're really off, beginning to think about that. And I think what we want to try and do is, just have a couple more slides. But thinking about modifying recruitment infrastructure, you're going to have that balance between site number, versus administrative burden. Modifying study design is something you have to think through, and that's where it's helpful to have a team of PIs. But you can also start to look at other recruitment strategies as well. And so I think we can probably hit pause and refer to this. But again, I think the most important thing is, don't be afraid to change your strategy. Don't be afraid to change your study. I've had to adjust myself. And that is, I think, the most important thing is flexibility. So I'm going to actually take questions, and I really am hopeful we'll have a discussion. I don't know, are people able to take themselves off mute and turn on their camera so we can have a conversation, Megan, or are people going to drop stuff in the chat? What's the best way to facilitate that?
Both options are great. We have a couple of questions in the chat that can get us started, and then
On my slideshow, I think
from
for
there we
that to
can,
happen.
I
Yeah.
can read it if that's easier.
Oh, no, it's okay. Let me just stop sharing. Oh, there's tons of questions in chat. Yeah, I forgot to say that. And if people want to come off and talk, I think that's fine too. Okay. All right. So I think the first question is, regarding the studies you have presented, it appears there's a bias to individuals who have participated. Yeah, so the assessments are missing individuals who've been offered, say, but not participate because of time, financial, or other reasons. Okay, yeah. So I think this is actually where electronic health records are really important. It used to be, and I didn't want to go too much into this, but we can for sure. It used to be that people, when they looked at grants, they would just look at like, did you hit your target number? But now, especially for many studies, they're looking at the accurate representatives of the demographics of that study. And I think this is where EHR can be really, really helpful. And when they now look at grants, including NIH grants, they'll look at your proposed recruitment, and they're going to see how well it aligns with your demographics, and they will give feedback if it's if there's a huge discrepancy between what you actually end up enrolling and anticipated. I think one of the really key things you want to do strategically is to really understand which groups are hardest to recruit from and really try to make sure you have well-developed strategies ahead of time. Because I think that's probably one of the biggest problems is that some people have hit their accrual targets, but they're not necessarily right in the subgroups. And I think that can be a huge problem. Okay.
And I
Oh,
think
okay. So, yeah, so something about patient engagement. Some grants. Yeah, so this is great. So, okay. So some grants, there's community engaged grants. I think PCORI grants and DoD grants are now saying like, did you get the patient's perspectives? I'm guessing that's the grants that Liz is talking about. So you can't build, I mean, you can maybe, but you probably can't just build that overnight. And this is where it helps to have, I think I've listed a bunch of collaborators. Please don't go solo. You know, you're busy, you're a clinician working 60 hours a week, right? And now where are you going to find the time to have a patient advisory board? I think joining up with people who are community engaged researchers, people who are interested in disease process but know the engagement component is really critical. I think one thing that a lot of patients tell me, no matter what field that they're in, they wish they could hear more from the clinician. So I think even like working with your institution to have, say, like twice a year meetings to provide information, right? Information is such an area of interest, could be the place where you could start to identify those patient advocates, because I guarantee you, in every disease that I've seen people work in, all you need is like really honestly 2 or 3 passionate people who are willing to help you invest the time to help get that together. And from there, you can form your patient advisory boards or those steering committees that a lot of grants ask for. So that's a great question. Find a collaborator for somebody who's in qualitative research and mixed methods or community engaged research, because I think a lot of you, I'm guessing, are extremely busy clinicians. And they're also the best people to help you do a process we call co-designing, which I can send people links about afterwards. Um, but there's actual processes called co-designing. And that's where you give them feedback about your study materials and engagement. And they give you feedback and then they can analyze the data. So that's a great question. Liz, I don't know if you have something else you wanted to add. I
Oh,
hope
I don't want to take the conversation, take over the conversation if there's other comments, but just to follow up on that,
yeah, go for it.
I think, yeah, it was not a PCORI grant, it was a foundation grant. And
Oh,
my question, I guess, was maybe PCORI has examples of like how, is it just as simple as saying we have a patient advisory panel and they reviewed the grant? Like, I guess the question is, how do you show that patients were engaged in the study? Like, how do you demonstrate that? Is it just like, oh, I had this idea, I talked to a few patients about it, they said sounds great, or like, is there a more formal way of actually documenting that process?
yeah, and there is actually a more formal way. So the way you want to begin to think about it, and this is where I want to be transparent. I collaborate with people who are experts because I'm busy seeing patients too. They actually have a process. There's different approaches. So, like for example, we're designing a toolkit to get certain communities who are higher risk to be engaged in shared decision making for cognitive screening. So the first thing we did is in that case, we did co-designing. So they helped us design the first round of the toolkit. And then after that, we took that and then we, tested it and they gave us feedback. We revised it. And then we did it for a couple cycles. So you could do something very similar. So the co-designing process is where patients, caregivers, other stakeholders, right, and then experts like you sit together and have, it seems like a conversation, but it's actually a scientific process. There's activities that individual a researcher who's trained in community engagement and mixed methodology can actually put together to help you talk about, especially like, I'm going to just give an example, like what we think of as intractable problems. So the activities are designed to build what we call group problem solving. And so it's about presenting like this seemingly intractable problem that we want to begin to figure out as a team, and then starting to say, help design the study, right? I think a big one I imagine you guys run into is like, I need to test people off drug, right, to see if this has an effect, but then your patients are really symptomatic and it's hard for them to come in, like how do you reconcile, right? That seemingly, I'm just making notes off the top of my head, but how do you reconcile that kind of seemingly like really challenging problem? And so a community engaged researcher will successfully be able to get all of you to get together, to begin to think about it together. And then how do you like, right? Do you need to explain in the recruitment materials, like how important it is for people to be off drug? Or is there different things that you could do to make the experience, yes, they have to be off drug for scientific reasons, but are there other things that you could do to design a study to make it more comfortable for them to be willing to at least try to come into a study knowing that they have to be off drug, right? In order to see if your drug works, or the experimental drug you're proposing test works. And so there is actually a bit more of a scientific process.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's multiple levels on which they could give input. One would be on like, is the study too burdensome? The other could be like the materials, like you mentioned, the toolkit. Then there's like the actual study
Correct. But
topic.
what you want is you want somebody who's a researcher who's going to help you think about that 50,000 feet problem, right? Because it's not about the right recruitment materials. It's about how do we solve, right? You want to find a new drug that's going to help manage these symptoms, right? That's the big picture. What's the best way to do it? And that's where the group problem solving is going to come in and say, this is the study design that, whatever reason we have to rigorously do. How do we communicate it? How do we get so it's about, again, taking that 50,000 feet view. And that's where it's really good to have somebody who is outside of the field in some ways, who is eager to learn. I think it's the other thing I want to emphasize is for community engaged research, for qualitative and mixed methods, try to find somebody who's I think a good junior person who's interested but doesn't know much about your disease, because then it'll at least has forced me as a clinician to have to explain things that seem very obvious to me, but has forced me to rethink my basic assumptions. A, do I really have to do this? Or B, yes, if we have to do this scientifically, how do I explain it to people in such a way that they understand why it's as necessary as I think it is? And going through that cognitive process myself, I think has really helped me both scientifically and clinically, honestly, when I talk to my patients. So those are great questions. Do other people have other questions? But I think, yeah, foundation grants and a lot of grants are driving towards making sure we have patient-centered sites. And it really has been shown to help with retention rates. I think another thing that if once you find those 2 or 3 advocates, as I have published, we've made sure to include our invested community advisory board members. And I think explaining to them the value of a publication, because some of them are like, what is this? But I think they've come to recognize the value of this. And so us also, as we get people engaged in research, explaining what we value to them, right? They're not going to get paid any better or get a higher, better grant score because of it, but they understand that we're sharing values and sharing the recognition. And I think people understand and get that. And so being able to share those cultural values are really important. So
Yes, I apologize. I can't be on camera. I thought it was an actual webinar, and I am taming my mane after this session and the next. So my question's probably too large to discuss. I have to jump at the top of the hour, but I work in the epilepsy space where there's a lot of work being done to challenge the traditional trial design wherein patients or participants are required to remain on active treatment or placebo for a pre-specified duration, regardless of their reduction in seizure frequency or an increase during that time. And one of the most feared risks being the risk of sudden unexpected death in epilepsy or SUDEP. And so there's a lot of resistance to kind of change or kind of move maybe toward a time to event study based on many key stakeholders, right? So the FDA and ensuring there are enough adverse events that are captured in a certain amount of time between active treatment and placebo. Maybe pharmaceutical companies who feel it might be risky to try a new trial design that makes it harder to compare their data with the traditional designs and historical data and so on and so forth. And so all of this as a pre-ramble, just interested in maybe your global view or experience of other spaces in neurology specifically where it's been possible over time to change and like what the success factors for that were.
Yeah. Wow, that's
It's a
that
lot.
yeah, no, that's something I think that would be good to reflect on, probably in a longer session, as you pointed out. But I
Mhm.
just taking a huge step back, I think what's really important is that change of any kind, no matter who it is or what it is always hard. And
For
I think
sure.
I think I think the bottom line is you have to tell people why. Doesn't I mean,
Hmm.
even as potentially life or death, as you just laid it out, you have to tell people why. Like even
Right.
I do ask people in, the community, explain to them why we have to do a blood draw, but then they
Right.
explain lab results from the blood draw, but it's like, no, we're only going to run research labs, so we can't really give those back because we don't know what I mean. Well, why don't you know what I mean? So I think what's a really good exercise to have with all the stakeholders we wrap up is be able to have a person who is persistent. And I had and still have someone like this on our community advisory board. Every time I gave an answer, they said, well, why do you have to do it this way? And I would say this. I was like, well, why do you have to do it that way? Have that person who will keep you honest and say why at the every single step. It will make you a better researcher and a better clinician. So
For
applying
sure.
the same principle, I think, from a 50,000 feet view is going to be something that you'll have to answer both to yourself, right, as a ethical clinician, but also to the individuals affected, whether it's a new study design or a new, type of procedure or anything like that.
For
So
sure. Yeah, we're generating a ton of data, reanalyzing all of the trials historically, both from an efficacy standpoint to determine if the trial results would have been the same, and then now going back and doing it with treatment emergent adverse effects as well. So
yeah.
certainly
That's a good,
generating
that's
data
a good,
and
that's a good, that's actually a good, project for somebody who wants to get into
yeah,
qualitative research,
yeah.
for epilepsy. So that sounds like a really key project that needs to be done. So, okay, I
Perfect.
want to
Thank you.
respect everyone's time. Thank you again for joining us. And I think Megan has put in the date of the next webinar. So take care and make sure you come back next week for the next presentation on the 26th.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sophia. Great talk. We'll see you all soon.